The mare's left foreleg buckled without warning, and Helena Morgan felt her stomach drop as the animal stumbled to a halt on the dusty trail, favoring the injured limb with desperate whimpers that cut through the afternoon silence. She dismounted quickly, her boots hitting the hard, packed earth with a thud, and ran her hands down the chestnut's leg, finding heat and swelling just above the fetlock that told her everything she needed to know. They were 8 miles from Fort Bridger, Wyoming, with the September sun already beginning its descent toward the western mountains, and she was utterly alone on a trail that wound through territory where civilization felt like a distant memory. "Easy, girl, easy," Helena murmured, stroking the mare's neck as tears pricked at her eyes. The horse had been her father's last gift before the fever took him 3 months ago, and now Rosie stood trembling on 3 legs, unable to bear weight on the 4th. Helena looked around at the landscape that stretched endlessly in all directions, sagebrush and rocky outcroppings dotting the terrain, the Wind River Range rising in blue-hazed layers to the north. She had been visiting the Patterson Ranch to deliver embroidered linens, trying to make ends meet since her father's death left her with nothing but a small cabin on the edge of town and skills with a needle. The year was 1876, and women without family or means had precious few options in frontier towns like Fort Bridger. She could not leave Rosie here. She could not shoot her, even if she had brought a gun, which she had not. Helena pressed her forehead against the mare's warm neck and tried to think through the rising panic. 8 miles on foot in the darkening day, through country where mountain lions prowled and worse things sometimes happened to women traveling alone. She would have to lead Rosie slowly, let her hobble along, and pray they made it before full dark. The sound of hoofbeats made her head snap up, and her hand instinctively went to the small knife at her belt. A lone rider approached from the north, moving at an easy lope along a game trail that intersected with the main road. As he drew closer, Helena felt her breath catch at the sheer size of the man. He sat astride a massive bay gelding, broad shoulders blocking out the sun behind him, long dark hair tied back with a leather cord. His buckskin shirt stretched across a chest that spoke of years spent hauling logs and traps through unforgiving mountains, and his arms, visible where the sleeves had been cut away, were corded with muscle that made the reins look like thread in his large, capable hands. He reined in 20 feet away, and Helena found herself looking up at a face weathered by wind and sun, with a strong jaw darkened by several days of stubble, and eyes the color of storm clouds over the mountains. Those eyes assessed the situation quickly, moving from her to the lame mare to the empty trail stretching toward town. "Horse went lame," he said, and his voice was deep and rough, like gravel shifting in a river. It was not a question. "Yes," Helena managed, lifting her chin despite the fear and frustration coursing through her. "Just now, I was heading back to Fort Bridger." The man dismounted in one fluid motion, and standing on the ground he was even more imposing, easily 6.5 feet tall, built like the mountains themselves. He moved toward Rosie with surprising gentleness, holding out one large hand for the mare to sniff, before running his fingers down the injured leg with a touch so careful it made something in Helena's chest tighten. "Fetlock is swollen," he said after a moment. "She needs rest and cold compresses. Walking her on it could make it worse." He straightened, and Helena had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "How far to town?" 8 miles, she said, hating how small her voice sounded. He nodded once as if making a decision and moved to his own horse, loosening the saddle girth. "You will ride Thunder, I will walk your mare home." Helena blinked, certain she had misheard. "I cannot ask you to walk 8 miles. You did not ask." He pulled the saddle from the bay's back with easy strength, the muscles in his arms and shoulders flexing beneath his shirt. "I am offering. Name is Zane Olson." He set the saddle on the ground and began removing the blanket. "Helena Morgan," she said automatically, her mind still trying to catch up. "But truly I cannot accept. You have your own business to attend to." Zane Olson looked at her then, really looked at her, and Helena felt the intensity of that gaze like a physical thing. "My business is trapping and hunting. The mountains are not going anywhere. You need to get home before dark and your horse needs care. The answer is simple." There was no arguing with the quiet certainty in his voice. Helena watched as he transferred his saddle to Rosie's back with movements so gentle the mare barely flinched, adjusting the stirrups for Helena's shorter legs. Then he gathered his supplies from the bay's saddlebags, slinging them over his own broad back, and took Rosie's reins in one massive hand. "Up you go," he said, gesturing to Thunder. Helena had ridden since childhood, but mounting the tall bay without stirrups proved challenging. Before she could struggle, Zane's hands closed around her waist, and he lifted her into the saddle as if she weighed nothing at all. The casual display of strength sent warmth flooding through her body, and she had to remind herself to breathe as she gathered the reins. Thunder shifted beneath her, a mountain of muscle and warm horseflesh, but responded immediately to her gentle pressure on the reins. Zane nodded in approval and started walking, setting a pace that was brisk but manageable for the injured mare. Helena kneed Thunder forward to walk beside him, the bay's longer stride making it easy to keep pace with the walking man. "You live in Fort Bridger?" Zane asked after they had traveled in silence for several minutes. "Yes, a cabin on the eastern edge of town. My father built it when he mustered out of the army 10 years ago." Helena paused, then added, "He died in June. I am sorry." The words were simple, but something in his tone made them feel genuine. "You have other family?" "No, it was just the two of us after my mother passed when I was young." Helena did not know why she was telling this stranger her life story, but there was something about his quiet, solid presence that made the words flow. "I do needlework and embroidery for the town families. It keeps me fed." Zane glanced up at her, those storm cloud eyes thoughtful. "That is hard work for hard living." "It is honest work," Helena said, lifting her chin again. Did not say it was not. A hint of something that might have been a smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Said it was hard." They walked on as the sun sank lower, painting the sky in shades of gold and orange that set the sagebrush aflame with light. Helena found herself studying her unlikely rescuer, taking in details she had missed in her initial panic. The knife at his belt was well worn, the leather sheath oiled and cared for. His boots were sturdy, handmade, and his buckskin clothing bore the marks of careful repair. This was not a man who wasted anything or took the easy path. "You live in the mountains?" she asked, more to fill the comfortable silence than from any desperate need to know. "Most of the year. I have a cabin about 20 miles north, up in the high country. Come to Fort Bridger maybe 4 times a year to trade furs and buy supplies." He adjusted his grip on Rosie's reins, his long legs eating up the ground with easy strides that suggested he could walk all day without tiring. "Was heading back from checking my trap lines when I saw you." "I am grateful you came along when you did," Helena said softly. "I was trying to figure out how I would manage." "Mountains teach you to help when you can," Zane said. "No telling when you might be the one needing help." The simple wisdom in that statement struck Helena as profound. In town, everyone was so concerned with propriety and appearances, with who owed what to whom and how helping someone might be perceived. This man simply saw a problem and solved it, expecting nothing in return. As they walked, the landscape gradually shifted from open prairie to more wooded terrain, with cottonwoods and willows marking the presence of creek beds. The trail wound between rock formations that cast long shadows in the fading light, and Helena was deeply grateful not to be facing this journey alone. She had heard too many stories of what could happen to solitary travelers in these lonely places. "How did you come to be a mountain man?" she asked, curiosity overcoming her usual reserve. Zane was quiet for a moment, as if considering how much to share. "Grew up in Missouri," he said finally. "Lost my family to cholera when I was 17. Did not see the point in staying in a place that reminded me of everything that was gone. Headed west and kept going until I found country that felt like it could be home. That was 8 years ago." Helena did quick arithmetic in her head. That made him 25, only 3 years older than herself. "Do you ever get lonely?" "Sometimes," he admitted. "But the mountains have their own kind of company. Eagles and elk, the sound of the wind through the pines, water running over rocks. It speaks if you know how to listen." He glanced up at her again. "What about you? You ever get lonely?" The question caught her off guard with its directness. "Yes," she said honestly. "Fort Bridger has people, but most of them knew my father better than they know me. They are kind enough, but it is not the same as having someone who truly knows you." "That is the hardest kind of lonely," Zane said quietly. "Being surrounded by people and still feeling alone." Something in the way he said it made Helena think he understood that feeling better than most. They had both lost everyone they loved. Both ended up in this wild territory trying to carve out some kind of life from the harsh landscape. The realization created a connection between them, invisible but real, like a thread pulling taut. The miles passed beneath Thunder's steady hooves and Zane's tireless stride. Helena found herself talking more than she had in months, telling him about her father's army days, about learning to embroider from an officer's wife who had taken pity on a motherless girl, about the strange feeling of being utterly alone in the world at 22. Zane listened with his whole attention, asking occasional questions that showed he was truly hearing her words, not just waiting for his turn to speak. In turn, he told her about his life in the mountains, about tracking a bull elk for 3 days through a snowstorm, about the time a grizzly bear had taken exception to his presence near a berry patch, about the perfect silence of a winter morning when the snow muffled every sound. His voice took on a different quality when he spoke of the wilderness, something approaching poetry in his rough way with words. The sun had nearly set when the first buildings of Fort Bridger came into view, the stockade walls and scattered cabins looking welcoming in the gathering dusk. Helena felt an odd disappointment that their journey was ending, that she would say goodbye to this strange, gentle giant of a man and likely never see him again. "Cabin is on the east side, you said," Zane asked, and Helena directed him through the quiet streets. Few people were out at this hour, though she saw Mrs. Patterson peer out her window as they passed, no doubt already composing the gossip she would spread tomorrow about Helena Morgan returning to town in the company of a wild-looking mountain man. Helena's cabin sat alone at the edge of town, a sturdy structure of logs and stone with a small barn behind it. Her father had built it to last, and it had weathered the years well. She dismounted in the yard, wincing at the stiffness in her legs from the long ride, and watched as Zane led both horses to the barn. "I will see to them," he said, already moving to unbuckle Thunder's saddle. "You should get a fire going. It will be cold tonight." Helena wanted to argue, to say she could care for her own horse, but the truth was her back ached, and her legs felt like rubber. She went into the cabin and built up the fire in the stone hearth, then lit the oil lamps that pushed back the darkness. By the time Zane knocked on the door, she had water heating for coffee and was slicing bread from yesterday's baking. "Rosie is settled," he said when she opened the door. "Gave her some grain and wrapped that fetlock. She should be right as rain in a week or two if you keep her off it." He stood in the doorway, looking uncertain for the first time since she had met him, as if unsure whether he was welcome to enter. "Please come in," Helena said, stepping back. "It is the least I can do after you walked 8 miles for me." Zane ducked through the doorway, and the cabin suddenly felt much smaller with his large frame taking up space. He removed his hat, revealing dark hair that fell past his shoulders, and his eyes scanned the room with the same careful assessment he had given Rosie's injury. Helena saw her home through his eyes. The simple furniture her father had made, the embroidered samplers on the walls that represented her best work, the neat orderliness of someone living alone. "You keep a good home," he said, and it sounded like genuine approval. "Thank you." Helena poured coffee into 2 tin cups and set out the bread with butter and jam. "Please sit. You must be tired." Zane lowered himself into one of the wooden chairs, which creaked alarmingly under his weight but held. He wrapped his large hands around the coffee cup, dwarfing it, and took a sip. "That is good coffee. Been drinking my own camp coffee for weeks." They ate in comfortable silence, and Helena found herself studying him in the lamplight. His face was strong and honest, with lines around his eyes that came from squinting into the sun and wind. His hands, though large and calloused, moved with surprising gentleness as he buttered his bread. Everything about him spoke of competence and quiet strength, and Helena felt safer in his presence than she had felt in months. "Where will you stay tonight?" she asked, suddenly worried. "The boarding house may be full with the wagon train that passed through yesterday," Zane shrugged. "I have slept under worse than a clear sky. There is a good spot down by the creek." "Absolutely not," Helena said before she could think better of it. "You walked 8 miles for me. The least I can do is offer you a proper bed for the night. The barn has a loft with clean hay and blankets. My father used to sleep there in the summer when the cabin got too hot." "I do not want to cause talk," Zane said carefully. "Small towns have long memories for gossip." "Let them talk," Helena said with more bravado than she felt. "I know my own mind and I know right from wrong. You helped me and I am offering hospitality in return. There is nothing improper about that." Zane studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Appreciated. Been a while since I slept anywhere that did not have rocks poking me in the ribs." After they finished eating, Helena walked him to the barn with a lantern, showing him where the blankets were stored and pointing out the ladder to the loft. Up close in the dim light, she realized just how tall he was, how his shoulders seemed to fill the doorway, how the muscles in his arms flexed as he climbed the ladder with easy strength. "Thank you again," she said from below, "for everything." His face appeared over the edge of the loft, shadowed and unreadable in the lamplight. "No thanks needed. Get some rest, Helena Morgan." The way he said her name, slow and deliberate, sent warmth spreading through her chest. She returned to the cabin and lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling and thinking about storm cloud eyes and gentle hands that could lift her like she weighed nothing. It had been a long time since she had felt anything beyond the day-to-day struggle of survival, but tonight something had shifted, like ice breaking on a river in spring. She fell asleep with a faint smile on her lips, feeling less alone than she had in months. Morning came with birdsong and the smell of wood smoke. Helena rose and dressed quickly, pinning up her dark hair and splashing water on her face from the basin. When she stepped outside, she found Zane already up, checking on Rosie in the barn. The morning light revealed details she had missed in yesterday's emergency. The way his hair caught the sun in shades of deep brown, the clean line of his jaw, the easy way he moved despite his size. "Morning," he said, looking up from rewrapping Rosie's fetlock. "Swelling has gone down some." "She is a tough one." "Like her owner," Helena said with a small smile. "Will you stay for breakfast before you head back to the mountains?" Zane straightened, and she saw him weighing his response. "Should get moving. Lost a day already, and winter comes early in the high country. Need to get my trap set." Disappointment bloomed in Helena's chest, sharp and unexpected. "Of course. You have been more than generous with your time." But he made no move to leave, instead standing there with his hands on his hips, looking down at his boots as if they held some answer he was seeking. Finally, he looked up and met her eyes. "When I come to town next, in about 6 weeks, would you mind if I stopped by? See how Rosie is healing?" Hope fluttered in Helena's chest like a trapped bird. "I would like that very much." Something that was definitely a smile crossed his face then, transforming his stern features into something almost boyish. "Good. That is good." Helena made him a quick breakfast of eggs and biscuits while he loaded his supplies onto Thunder. When it was time for him to go, they stood in the yard together, the morning sun warming the earth around them, and Helena found she did not know what to say. "How did you thank someone for changing everything with a simple act of kindness? Travel safe," she finally managed. "You too," Zane said. Then he swung up into Thunder's saddle with easy grace, settling his weight. "Take care of that horse." "I will." He touched 2 fingers to the brim of his hat in farewell, then turned Thunder north toward the mountains. Helena watched him ride away until he disappeared around a bend in the trail, and even then she stood there, feeling the ghost of his presence like warmth from a fire. The next 6 weeks passed with agonizing slowness. Helena threw herself into her work, taking on every embroidery commission she could find. She stitched flowers on pillow slips for the mercantile owner's wife, monogrammed handkerchiefs for the new schoolteacher, and hemmed more skirts than she could count. The work kept her hands busy but not her mind, which kept drifting to storm cloud eyes and a voice like gravel shifting in a river. Rosie healed well, the swelling in her fetlock disappearing within 2 weeks. By the end of the month, the mare was moving soundly again, though Helena was careful to keep her work light. She found excuses to ride out along the northern trail, telling herself she was just exercising the horse, not hoping for a glimpse of a broad-shouldered mountain man, Mrs. Patterson did indeed spread gossip about Helena's return to town with a strange man, but Helena weathered it with her chin up and her mouth shut. Let them talk. She knew the truth, and that was enough. On the 41st day after Zane had left, Helena was hanging laundry in her yard when she heard hoofbeats approaching from the north. Her heart leaped into her throat, and she dropped the shirt she was holding, shielding her eyes against the afternoon sun to see who was coming. Thunder's distinctive coat was unmistakable, and the man on his back even more so. Zane rode into her yard like something out of a dream, and Helena could not stop the smile that spread across her face. "You came," she said as he dismounted, and she heard the joy in her own voice. "Said I would." He looked her up and down, his gaze thorough but not improper. "You look well, so do you." It was true. He looked exactly as she remembered, solid and real and impossibly handsome in his rough way. "How was your trapping?" "Good, got some prime pelts to trade." He gestured to the packs on Thunder's back, but wanted to check on Rosie first. They walked to the barn together, close enough that their arms almost touched, and Zane examined the mare with the same careful thoroughness he had shown before. "She looks perfect," he pronounced. "You did good work with her. I just followed your instructions. Still counts." Helena felt absurdly pleased by the praise. "Will you stay for supper? I have a venison stew on the fire. If you are offering, I am accepting." They fell into an easy rhythm, as if they had done this 100 times before. Helena cooked while Zane tended to Thunder. Then they sat at her small table and talked while the evening light faded outside. He told her about his 6 weeks in the mountains, about the lynx he had spotted near his cabin, and the early snow that had dusted the peaks. She told him about her work, about the new family that had moved to town, about the traveling preacher who had stopped through and delivered a fire and brimstone sermon that had the whole congregation squirming in their seats. "You ever think about doing something different?" Zane asked as they lingered over coffee. "Moving somewhere with more opportunity?" Helena considered the question. "Sometimes, but this is home for better or worse. My father is buried here. My memories are here." She paused. "What about you? Do you ever think about coming down from the mountains?" "Sometimes," he admitted. "Gets lonely up there, like I said. But I do not know if I could stand being around people all the time again. Cities feel like they are suffocating me." "Fort Bridger is hardly a city." "True enough." He studied her across the table, and Helena felt the weight of that gaze. "You would like the mountains, I think. They have their own kind of peace." "Maybe you could show me someday," Helena said, the words out before she could second-guess them. Zane's eyes darkened with something that might have been hope. "I would like that." He left the next morning with a promise to return in another 6 weeks, and this time Helena watched him go with more anticipation than sadness. Something was building between them, slow and steady as stone being worn smooth by water, and she could feel it in every glance, every carefully chosen word. The pattern continued through the fall and into winter. Every 6 weeks, like clockwork, Zane would ride into Fort Bridger with his packs of furs, and his first stop was always Helena's cabin. They would share meals and conversation, their words growing more personal with each visit, the walls around their hearts crumbling brick by brick. He told her about his family in Missouri, about the little sister he had adored, and the parents who had worked themselves to the bone trying to make a life on the frontier. She told him about her mother's death, about the loneliness of being an only child, about her dreams of maybe someday having a family of her own. On his 4th visit, in the dead of winter with snow piled high around the cabin, Zane brought her a gift, a pair of rabbit fur mittens he had made himself, the stitching careful and even. Helena held them to her cheek, feeling the softness, and had to blink back tears. "They are beautiful," she said. "You made these." "Man learns to do a lot of things when he lives alone," Zane said, looking embarrassed. "Thought you might need them, walking to town in the cold." Helena threw her arms around him without thinking, pressing her face into his chest, and felt his arms come around her slowly, carefully, as if she were something precious he was afraid to break. He was so warm, so solid, and she could hear his heart beating fast beneath his buckskin shirt. "Thank you," she whispered. "You are welcome, Helena." They stood like that for a long moment, and when Helena finally pulled back, she saw something in Zane's eyes that made her breath catch. Want and longing and careful hope all mixed together. "I have been thinking," he said slowly, his hand still resting lightly on her shoulders, "about maybe spending more time in town. Could get a job hauling lumber at the mill or working at the stockade, something that would let me stay close to Fort Bridger instead of heading back to the mountains." Helena's heart hammered in her chest. "Why would you want to do that?" "I think you know why." His voice was rough, almost breaking. "Been 8 months since I walked beside you for those 8 miles, and I have not stopped thinking about you once. You are the first thing I think about when I wake up and the last thing before I sleep. When I am in the mountains, I am counting the days until I can see you again." Helena felt tears slip down her cheeks, but they were happy tears, joyful tears. "I feel the same way. I have been half alive since my father died, just going through the motions, but when you are here, I feel like I can breathe again." Zane's thumb brushed across her cheek, wiping away her tears with infinite gentleness. "I am not a fancy man, Helena. I do not have much to offer beyond strong arms and a willingness to work hard, but I would spend every day trying to make you happy if you would let me." "I do not need fancy," Helena said, her voice shaking with emotion. "I just need you." He kissed her then, slow and sweet, his lips warm against hers. Helena melted into him, her hands fisting in his shirt, and felt like she was finally home after a long journey through wilderness. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard, and Zane rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he said simply. "Probably have since I lifted you onto Thunder's back that first day." "I love you too," Helena whispered. "I was just too scared to admit it." They talked deep into the night, making plans and dreaming dreams. Zane would speak to the mill owner about work, would move into the barn loft properly with Helena's permission. They would court properly, give the town no reason to gossip, and when enough time had passed, they would marry. Neither wanted to wait long, but they would do things right. By the time Zane left the next morning to sell his furs and speak to the mill owner, Helena felt like she was walking on air. Everything she had thought lost, all the hope she had buried with her father, came rushing back in a flood that left her dizzy and laughing. The mill owner, a gruff man named Benjamin Stone, hired Zane on the spot after watching him lift a log that usually required 2 men. Zane traded his furs for supplies and a better set of town clothes, though Helena privately thought he looked just as handsome in buckskin. He moved his few possessions into the barn loft, and true to his word, was the picture of propriety. Fort Bridger watched with interest as the mountain man courted Helena Morgan. He walked her to church on Sundays, attended town socials at her side, and helped repair the roof of old Mr. Henderson's cabin when a winter storm damaged it. Slowly, the town accepted him as one of their own, this quiet giant who worked harder than any 3 men and loved Helena Morgan with an intensity that was impossible to miss. Spring came early in 1877, melting the snow and turning the prairie green. Zane had been working at the mill for 3 months, and he had saved nearly every penny of his wages. On a warm April evening, he asked Helena to walk with him along the creek that ran behind her cabin. They strolled hand in hand as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Zane was quieter than usual, and Helena could sense his nervousness in the tension of his fingers around hers. "Something wrong?" she asked, squeezing his hand. "No, opposite actually." He stopped walking and turned to face her, and Helena felt her heart start to race. "I know we have only been courting proper for 3 months, but I have known you for almost a year now. Feels like I have known you my whole life, to be honest." Helena could barely breathe as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wooden box. Inside was a ring made of twisted silver, simple and beautiful. "I made it myself," Zane said, his voice rough with emotion. "Had the silversmith in town teach me how. It is not much, but it is honest work, just like you said once." He got down on one knee, this massive man kneeling before her, and looked up at her with love shining clear in his storm cloud eyes. "Helena Morgan, will you marry me?" "Yes," Helena said through her tears. "Yes, absolutely yes." He stood and slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. Which, she realized, it had been. Then he kissed her thoroughly, right there by the creek, and Helena knew that every lonely night, every moment of fear and uncertainty, had been worth it to lead her to this moment. They were married 6 weeks later in Fort Bridger's small church, with most of the town in attendance. Helena wore her mother's wedding dress, which she had carefully altered to fit, and carried wildflowers that Zane had picked himself from the meadows. Zane wore his best clothes, his long hair pulled back, and looked so handsome that Helena's breath caught when she saw him waiting at the altar. The ceremony was simple and heartfelt, and when the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Zane kissed her with such tenderness that several of the women in the congregation sighed audibly. They walked out of the church hand in hand into the May sunshine, and Helena felt like her heart might burst with happiness. The town had prepared a celebration in the community hall, with food and music and dancing. Helena had never been much of a dancer, but Zane moved with surprising grace for such a large man, and he held her close as they swayed to the fiddle music. "Happy," he murmured against her hair. "More than I knew was possible," Helena said honestly. That night, in the cabin that was now truly theirs, Zane carried her over the threshold and set her down gently. He had spent the last month making improvements, building a larger bed frame and a proper wardrobe, repairing everything that needed repair. The cabin gleamed with his attention, every corner speaking of his care. "I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret choosing me," Zane said seriously, framing her face with his large hands. "I could never regret you," Helena said, rising on her toes to kiss him. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me." Their wedding night was everything Helena had dreamed of and more, full of tenderness and passion, of gentle touches and whispered words of love. Zane treated her like she was made of glass, careful and reverent, until she pulled him closer and showed him she was stronger than she looked. They learned each other slowly, thoroughly, and when Helena finally fell asleep in her husband's arms, she felt complete in a way she never had before. The months that followed were the happiest of Helena's life. Zane continued working at the mill while Helena kept up her embroidery work, and together they made enough to live comfortably. They talked about eventually buying more land, maybe raising horses since Rosie had proven such a good animal. Everything felt possible with Zane at her side. On a hot July day, Helena was hanging laundry when a wave of dizziness washed over her. She sat down hard on the ground, waiting for the world to stop spinning. It had been happening more often lately, along with an odd queasiness in the mornings that she had been trying to ignore. When Zane came home from the mill that evening, covered in sawdust and sweat, he found Helena sitting at the table with a stunned expression on her face. "What is wrong?" he asked immediately, crossing to her side. "Are you hurt?" "No," Helena said slowly, then looked up at him with wonder dawning in her eyes. "Zane, I think I am with child." His face went through a series of expressions so quickly Helena almost laughed, shock, fear, then pure joy. "Truly?" "I think so. All the signs are there. I should know for certain in another month or so, but I am almost positive." Zane dropped to his knees beside her chair and pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair. "A baby," he breathed. "Our baby." Helena felt his shoulders shake and realized he was crying. This strong, stoic man reduced to tears by the news that he would be a father. She held him tight, her own tears flowing freely, and they stayed like that for a long time, wrapped in each other and the promise of the future. Helena's suspicions proved correct. As summer turned to fall, her belly began to swell with new life. Zane was alternately thrilled and terrified, reading every book he could find about pregnancy and childbirth, asking the doctor endless questions, treating Helena like she might shatter at any moment. "I am pregnant, not dying," Helena told him with exasperation after he insisted on carrying her the 10 feet from the cabin to the barn. "I know," Zane said seriously, "but you are carrying the most precious thing in the world, and I am not taking any chances." His protectiveness would have been annoying if it had not been so clearly born of love. He took over all the heavy chores, chopped extra firewood for the winter, and saved every spare penny for the baby. He also started building a cradle in the barn, working on it every evening by lamplight, and Helena would watch him through the window, her heart full to bursting. Winter came early and harsh that year, but the cabin was warm and well stocked. Helena's belly grew round and heavy, and she spent her days sewing tiny clothes and blankets while Zane worked at the mill. They had decided to name the baby Samuel if it was a boy, after Zane's father, and Grace if it was a girl, after Helena's mother. On a freezing February night in 1878, Helena's labor began. Zane rode through the snow to fetch the midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Chen, who had delivered half the babies in Fort Bridger. Then he paced the cabin like a caged animal while Helena labored in their bedroom, the midwife and 2 neighbor women attending her. Labor was long and hard, stretching through the night and into the next morning. Zane wore a path in the floorboards with his pacing, and when he heard Helena cry out in pain, it took all his willpower not to break down the bedroom door. Finally, as dawn light crept through the windows, a new sound filled the cabin, the lusty wail of a newborn baby. Mrs. Chen emerged a moment later, smiling. "You have a son, Mr. Olson, a big, healthy boy, and your wife is doing well." Zane nearly collapsed with relief. "Can I see them? Give us a few more minutes to get them settled." Those were the longest minutes of Zane's life, but finally the midwife called him in. Helena lay propped up on pillows, exhausted but glowing, and in her arms was a tiny bundle wrapped in one of the blankets she had made. Zane approached slowly, almost afraid to breathe. "Meet your son," Helena said softly, pulling back the blanket to reveal a red, wrinkled face and a shock of dark hair. Zane sat carefully on the edge of the bed and reached out one large finger to touch the baby's tiny hand. Impossibly small fingers wrapped around his, and Zane felt something in his chest crack open. "He is perfect," he whispered. "You are perfect." "Samuel Zane Olson," Helena said, looking down at their son with love. "Do you approve?" "I approve of everything about him." Zane leaned over to kiss Helena's forehead. "Thank you. Thank you for him, for everything." They sat together in the early morning light, the 3 of them, and Zane thought about how his life had changed that day almost 2 years ago when he had come across a woman with a lame horse. He had given her his horse and walked beside her, never imagining that simple act of kindness would lead to this. A wife he adored, a son he would die to protect, and a life richer than anything he had dreamed possible. Samuel proved to be an easy baby, sleeping well and eating heartily. He had his father's storm-cloud eyes and his mother's delicate features, and he was thoroughly spoiled by both parents. Zane would come home from the mill and spend hours just holding his son, talking to him in low, rumbling tones about everything and nothing. As Samuel grew from infant to toddler, Zane taught him about the world with the same patient thoroughness he brought to everything. They would walk in the woods behind the cabin, Zane pointing out animal tracks and bird calls, Samuel babbling happily from his perch on his father's broad shoulders. Helena would watch them from the doorway and feel overwhelmed with gratitude for the life they had built. When Samuel was 2, Helena discovered she was pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, and on a warm September evening in 1880, she gave birth to a daughter they named Grace Helena. The little girl had her mother's dark hair and her father's strength, announcing her arrival with powerful lungs. Samuel was fascinated by his baby sister, wanting to touch her constantly with his chubby toddler hands. Zane would sit with both children in the evenings, one on each knee, and tell them stories about the mountains and the animals that lived there. Helena would work on her embroidery and listen, thinking that this was what happiness sounded like. children laughing and a husband's deep voice spinning tales in the firelight. The years passed in a blur of school days and birthdays, of scraped knees and childhood illnesses, of love and laughter and the everyday miracle of family. Zane left the mill and bought land, building up a small horse ranch with Helena's help. They raised good animals and taught their children to respect the land and work hard. Samuel grew tall and strong like his father, with the same quiet competence and gentle nature. Grace was fierce and independent, able to outride most of the boys in town by the time she was 10. Both children knew they were loved beyond measure, and they thrived under their parents' careful attention. When Samuel was 12 and Grace was 10, Helena gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl they named Jacob and Rose. The house felt full to bursting with 4 children, but Zane and Helena would not have changed a thing. He built additions to the cabin, making room for the growing family, and Helena sewed until her fingers ached to keep everyone clothed. Life was not always easy. There were years when the horses did not sell well, winters when illness swept through and everyone took turns being sick, moments of fear when children got hurt or lost. But through it all, Zane and Helena faced everything together, their love the foundation that held the family strong. On their 20th anniversary, Zane surprised Helena with a trip into the mountains, just the two of them. The older children stayed with the younger ones, and for 3 days, Zane and Helena disappeared into the wilderness he had once called home. He took her to his old cabin, still standing though weathered by time, and showed her the valleys where he had trapped, the peaks he had climbed. They made love under the stars, their bodies still fitting together perfectly after all these years, and talked about everything they had built together. "Do you ever regret leaving the mountains?" Helena asked as they lay wrapped in blankets by their campfire. "Not once," Zane said firmly. "You and the children are my home now. This," he gestured at the wilderness around them, "is beautiful. But it is nothing compared to what we have built together." Helena kissed him, slow and deep, pouring 20 years of love into it. "I love you, Zane Olson, more now than even on the day I married you." "Same, Helena. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, and I thank God every day that your horse went lame miles from town." They laughed together at the memory, at how something that had seemed like a disaster had turned into the greatest blessing of their lives. The years continued their steady march. Samuel grew into a man and fell in love with the blacksmith's daughter, a sweet girl named Anna who fit into the family perfectly. They married when Samuel was 21, and Zane and Helena became grandparents a year later when Anna gave birth to a son. Grace was harder to tame, rejecting several suitors before finally falling for a young rancher from Montana who was tough enough to match her spirit. They married and moved north, though they visited often, and soon added to the growing brood of grandchildren. Jacob and Rose, the twins, were inseparable and caused twice the trouble. But they had good hearts, and Zane and Helena raised them with the same love and patience they had given all their children. As Zane's hair turned silver and lines deepened around Helena's eyes, they would sit on the porch of their expanded cabin and watch their grandchildren play in the yard where their own children had once run. The ranch was thriving, the family was healthy and happy, and the love between them had only deepened with time. "You know what I realized the other day?" Helena said one evening as they sat watching the sunset. "What is that?" Zane's arm was around her shoulders, her head resting against his chest. "That if I could go back and change anything, even the hard parts, I would not. Because all of it, every moment, led me to you and this life we built." Zane kissed the top of her head. "I was thinking the exact same thing. Even losing my family, as terrible as that was, brought me west to these mountains. And these mountains led me to a woman with a lame horse who needed help. Best decision I ever made, accepting your offer to ride thunder, Helena said with a smile. Best decision I ever made, offering, Zane agreed. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear overhead, the same stars that had witnessed their first meeting all those years ago. They had been strangers then, two lonely people trying to survive in a harsh land. Now they were husband and wife, parents and grandparents, partners in every sense of the word. Zane had given Helena his horse that day and walked beside her for 8 miles. But the truth was, he had been walking beside her ever since, through every joy and sorrow, every triumph and challenge. And Helena had been walking beside him, her hand in his, their love lighting the way. As they aged into their golden years, Zane and Helena became pillars of the Fort Bridger community. Zane, now in his 60s, had finally allowed Samuel to take over most of the ranch work, though he still insisted on checking the horses every morning and evening. His hair was completely silver now, but he was still as strong as many men half his age, his shoulders unbowed by time. Helena, at 59, had become the woman that younger wives came to for advice about marriage, children, and life. Her embroidery work was legendary, displayed in homes throughout Wyoming territory, and she had taught dozens of girls the craft over the years. Her dark hair was streaked with white, pulled back in the same simple style she had always worn, and her hands bore the marks of decades of needlework. But when Zane looked at her, he still saw the frightened young woman standing beside a lame horse, chin lifted against fear. And when Helena looked at him, she still saw the gentle giant who had given her everything without asking for anything in return. They had 9 grandchildren now, with a 10th on the way. Samuel and Anna had 4 children, 3 boys and a girl. Grace and her husband Thomas had 2 daughters and a son. Jacob had married a teacher from back east and had twin daughters. Rose had shocked everyone by marrying a doctor and moving to Denver, but she came home often with her son. The house that Zane had built and rebuilt and expanded over the years was never quiet. Grandchildren ran through constantly, seeking treats from grandmother Helena or stories from grandfather Zane. He would sit in his chair by the fire, children clustered around his feet, and tell tales of the old days when he had lived alone in the mountains, when Fort Bridger had been even smaller than it was now, when he had met a woman whose horse went lame and changed his life forever. On their 40th anniversary, the entire family gathered for a celebration. Children and grandchildren filled the house and spilled out into the yard, 3 generations of Olsons united by the love of 2 people who had found each other against all odds. Samuel stood to make a toast, tall and dignified at 40 years old. "To my parents," he said, raising his glass, "who taught us all what love really means, not pretty words or grand gestures, though they have had their share of both, but the everyday choice to walk beside someone, no matter how long the road or how difficult the journey. Thank you for showing us how it is done." Everyone raised their glasses, and Zane and Helena looked at each other with tears in their eyes. This was their legacy, not just the children and grandchildren, but the love that had created them, sustained them, and would continue long after Zane and Helena were gone. As the party continued around them, Zane pulled Helena aside to the quiet of the porch where they had spent so many evenings. 40 years, he said wonderingly. Feels like yesterday and forever all at once. I know what you mean, Helena said, lacing her fingers through his. His hands were as large and strong as ever, though spotted with age now, and her ring still gleamed on her finger, the silver worn smooth by decades of wearing. If I could do it all again, I would not change a single thing, Zane said seriously. Every moment with you has been a gift. Even the hard times, Helena asked with a small smile. The year the sickness came through and we almost lost Grace. The winter when money was so tight we did not know how we would make it. The arguments we have had over the years, even those, Zane confirmed, because we faced them together. And we came out stronger every time. He cupped her face in his hands, the gesture as familiar as breathing after 4 decades. I love you, Helena Morgan Olson. Have since the moment you lifted your chin and told me your horse was lame. Will until the day I die and beyond if such things are possible. Helena felt tears slip down her cheeks, but they were happy tears. I love you too, Zane. You are the best man I have ever known, and I thank God every day that He put you on that trail at exactly the right moment. They kissed then, soft and sweet, and Helena thought about the mystery of love, how a single moment of kindness had blossomed into this rich, full life. Zane had given her his horse and walked beside her home, but he had also given her his heart, his strength, his unwavering devotion. And she had given him the same in return, building something together that was greater than either of them alone. As the sun set over the Wyoming prairie, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold, Zane and Helena Olson stood together on their porch, surrounded by the evidence of their love: children, grandchildren, a thriving ranch, a community they had helped build. They had started with nothing but loneliness and a lame horse, and they had created everything that mattered. Ready to go back to the party? Helena asked after a while. In a minute, Zane said, pulling her close. Want to hold you a bit longer, just the two of us. Helena settled against his chest, hearing the steady beat of his heart, and smiled. This was what happiness sounded like, felt like, tasted like. Not the absence of hardship, but the presence of love strong enough to weather any storm. They had walked beside each other for 40 years, and God willing, they would walk beside each other for many more. And when their time finally came, Helena knew they would face that final journey together too, hand in hand, as they had faced everything else. But that was for another day. Today, they had a house full of family, love enough to fill the sky and each other. What more could anyone need? As darkness fell and the stars emerged overhead, Zane and Helena finally returned to the celebration, greeted by the happy chaos of their family. And if they held hands a little tighter than usual, if they looked at each other a little longer, no one mentioned it. They all knew the story, had heard it told and retold over the years. How grandfather Zane had seen grandmother Helena's horse go lame miles from town. How he had given her his and walked beside her home. How that simple act of kindness had grown into the greatest love story any of them knew. It was a story worth telling, a story worth remembering, a story that would be passed down through the generations as a reminder that sometimes the best things in life come from unexpected places, from lame horses and long walks and the choice to help someone in need. And somewhere in the mountains north of Fort Bridger, in a valley where Zane had once trapped and lived alone, the wind whispered through the pines and carried with it the echo of that long-ago day when everything had changed. The mountains remembered, as mountains do, the lonely man who had left them for love and never regretted it for a single moment. Years continued their steady progression, as they always do. Zane and Helena grew older, their steps slower but their love undiminished. They sat together on quiet evenings, sometimes talking, sometimes in comfortable silence, secure in the knowledge that they were exactly where they belonged. When Zane was 73 and Helena 70, they took one last trip to the mountains together. Their children protested, worried about their health, but Zane and Helena insisted. They needed to see the high country one more time, to stand where Zane had once lived and remember the journey that had brought them together. They rode slowly, taking their time, and camped in the valley below Zane's old cabin. The structure had finally collapsed, returning to the earth, but the memories remained strong and clear. "I was so lonely here," Zane said as they sat by their campfire. "Did not even realize how much until I met you and understood what I had been missing." "I was lonely too," Helena said. "Surrounded by people but completely alone. You changed that, Zane. You gave me everything." "We gave each other everything," he corrected gently. They made love that night under the stars, their bodies aged but still familiar, still able to bring each other pleasure and comfort. And when they fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, they dreamed of all the years behind them and the time they had left together. The ride back to Fort Bridger took 3 days, and by the time they arrived home, both were exhausted but happy. They had said goodbye to the mountains, to that chapter of their lives, and made peace with everything that had come before. 2 years later, in the spring of 1919, Zane fell ill with pneumonia. The doctor did everything he could, and Helena nursed her husband with all the skill and love she possessed. But at 75, Zane's body had finally reached its limit. On a warm May morning, with Helena holding his hand and all his children gathered around, Zane Olson took his last breath. His final words were, "Love you, Helena," and his last expression was one of peace. Helena felt like her heart had been ripped from her chest. For 52 years, Zane had been her constant companion, her partner in all things, her greatest love. The world without him felt empty and wrong, and she did not know how she would face each day. But she did face them, because that was what Zane would have wanted. She leaned on her children and grandchildren, found comfort in her great-grandchildren, and slowly learned to live with the grief. It never went away, but it became bearable, a dull ache rather than a sharp agony. She told stories about Zane to anyone who would listen, keeping his memory alive through words. The mountain man who had saved her that long-ago day, who had loved her with every fiber of his being, who had built a life and family with her, that would endure long after both of them were gone. Helena lived 3 more years without Zane, 3 years of watching her family continue to grow and thrive. She saw Samuel's oldest son married, held her first great-great-grandchild, and finished one final embroidery project. A wall hanging that told the story of a woman and a lame horse and the man who had helped her. On a cold February morning in 1922, Helena Morgan Olson died peacefully in her sleep at the age of 73. Her children found her with a smile on her face, and clutched in her hands was the shirt Zane had worn on their wedding day, which she had kept all these years. They buried her beside Zane in the Fort Bridger cemetery, under a simple headstone that read, "Together forever." And if the mountains seemed to sigh that day, if the wind carried a sound almost like rejoicing, no one remarked on it. They knew that Zane and Helena were together again, walking side by side through whatever came next, just as they had walked together through life. Their legacy lived on in their children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and beyond. The ranch continued to thrive under Samuel's management, and later his sons. The story of how Zane and Helena met became family legend, told and retold at gatherings, a reminder of the power of simple kindness and enduring love. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind blew down from the mountains, people swore they could see 2 figures walking together on the old trail north of town. A tall, broad-shouldered man and a slender woman, moving side by side through the fading light. No one could ever quite catch them, and by morning they were always gone. But their presence lingered, a reminder that some loves are strong enough to transcend even death, that some bonds cannot be broken by anything, not time nor distance nor even the final journey. Zane Olson had seen Helena Morgan's horse go lame miles from town. He had given her his and walked beside her home. In doing so, he had changed both their lives forever, creating a love story for the ages, a testament to the truth that sometimes the greatest adventures begin with the simplest acts of kindness. And in Fort Bridger, Wyoming, that story lived on, passed down through generations, a shining example of what love could be when two people committed to walking beside each other, no matter how long or difficult the road. It was a story of strength and gentleness, of protection and partnership, of two lonely souls who found each other against all odds and built something beautiful that would endure forever. The end came not with drama or tragedy, but with the peaceful certainty that their love had been real, had mattered, had created ripples that would spread through time. Zane and Helena Olson had lived fully, loved deeply, and left the world better than they found it. What more could anyone ask for? Their great-grandson, decades later, would stand at their graves and tell his own children the story. And those children would grow up hearing about the mountain man and the woman with the lame horse, about the choice to help someone in need that had blossomed into the greatest love their family had ever known. The story would never die, because stories like that never do. They live on in the hearts of those who hear them, inspiring new generations to be kind, to be brave, to take chances on love even when it seems impossible. They remind us that we are all just one moment away from something that could change our lives forever, if we are willing to take that first step, to offer our horse and walk beside someone toward home. And somewhere in the mountains above Fort Bridger, the wind still whispers through the pines, carrying with it the memory of two people who found each other, loved each other, and created something that would last forever. Zane and Helena Olson, mountain man and the woman he saved, husband and wife, partners and best friends, proof that sometimes the best things in life come from the most unexpected places. Their love story was complete, their ending as beautiful as their beginning, their legacy secure in the generations that followed. They had walked beside each other through life, and now they walked together through eternity, forever united, forever remembered, forever an example of what love could be when it was true and deep and lasting. The sun sets over Wyoming as it has for millions of years, painting the sky in brilliant colors. And if you listen carefully on quiet evenings, you might hear the echo of hoofbeats on the old trail, the sound of two people walking together, side by side, toward home, toward love, toward everything that matters. Zane and Helena Olson had found their happily ever after, and it was more beautiful than either of them had ever dared to dream.